I'm going to be talking to economist Kevin Birn from IHS MarkIt about pipelines. There is likely going to be another 900,000 barrels a day of oil produced in Canada that has to get to market. 650,000 barrels a day will likely come from the oil sands, which means, given it has to be diluted, that'll be more than 650,000 barrels a day of pipeline capacity needed. Where is it going to come from? So, Kevin, welcome to the interview.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, pipelines have been in the news for a long time. We're not likely to see any new projects approved, but we do have Trans Mountain expansion with 525,000 barrels a day of capacity, should be completed in 2022. Line 3, which adds another 370,000 barrels a day of capacity, should be ready by the end of this year. Is that enough?
Well, there's actually more than those two as well. There's additional optimizations that have been announced that could go forward on the Keystone system. And Enbridge has also announced that there's potential further optimizations could add, I think, somewhere around 300,000, if not a little bit more than that, to the takeaway system. If you put that all into the mix, we think it'll all pretty much get used. Now, when you look forward, there's other things that could come into play, and we can talk about diluent reduction units, that basically remove diluent and to improve the economics in crude by rail. There's also partial upgrading technologies that a number of companies would like to advance as well that can reduce the diluent. So it plays with the margins. But we think with all those things taken in, those optimizations, Trans Mountain and Line 3, it does look like the system could balance on pipeline. And it's important to balance on pipeline for the producers, because if you don't have adequate pipeline, you have to pay for a more costly form of transportation, which is typically then rail, and that results in a lower price in Western Canada than it would otherwise be possible through pipeline.
Now, Kevin, I think it was about 3 years ago, Energy Media did a story about Enbridge saying that at that time it had 500,000 barrels a day of potential debottlenecking and optimization that it could perhaps implement. It was looking at it at that time. And it sounds like it's gone ahead with a lot of that. And I think, is that not a big untold story? We don't talk about it much, about how the pipeline companies have become more efficient and can now put much more supply through their pipelines than they used to?
I think that's true. We did see, almost continuous creep over the last few years on the Western Canadian takeaway system. And that is an untold or underreported story that the pipeline companies leaving the Western Canadian Basin have done an incredible job maximizing and optimizing their takeaway capacity. And we did see that creep. And that's why we didn't see blowouts earlier than 2018, like we did see in 2018. And it's the reason the Western Canadian supply was able to continue to reach market through those periods. There was also, obviously the great ramp up in crude by rail preceding the COVID impacts as well, that grew. Then the understanding, the capability, and the capacity to move crude oil in Western Canada grew as well through that period. But you're right, there was a lift in the availability to move crude on existing systems.
Now, you mentioned diluent recovery, and a year or two ago, Gibson Energy announced that it had an American partner, and it was going to be doing a 50,000 barrel a day diluent recovery unit project north of Edmonton, I believe. And their partner was Conoco. And one thing that stood out from that announcement was that the economics of DRUbit, D-U-R-B as they call it, were competitive with pipelines. And it seems that I think that project has gone ahead. And what do you think about the potential for DRUbit and NeatBit and RailBit and other types of those technologies? So, as you say, play at the margins to pick up what pipelines aren't able to transport.
So way back in 2014, I think we wrote a paper comparing the economics of exporting DRUbit by pipe versus rail. And we showed that there, in some scenarios with diluent recovery units, the economics could come close. And we still saw pipeline being just modestly advantaged at that point. Rail adds a level of complexity, and so it's additional logistic complexities for the company to undertake. It also, the undiluted barrel has to go to a facility capable of dealing with the undiluted barrel on the other side. as well. So it adds complexity on the downstream side as well. We still see pipelines being the preferred route because they're the most understood. Frankly, the economics are still slightly better in our mind. But it ultimately comes down to as well on the export of a undiluted barrel or a less diluted barrel. There's a little bit of diluent left in, is where the destination is. And, this goes to the point about arbitrage. Those pipelines are, pipelines are gonna be mad, but they're tubes that go from somewhere to somewhere. They don't always connect to everywhere you want to go. A rail, on the other hand, in North America has the ability to move to places where there's potential upsides in price and capture a little bit of arbitrage opportunity as well.
Well, let's talk about partial upgrading, because that was a big talking point in 2017, 2018. The Alberta government had a $2 billion program that later got canceled. But we're seeing a couple of companies, that Fractel would be one of them. They have a contract with Cenovus to reduce the amount, to basically upgrade the diluted bitumen to maybe a heavy crude, or a lot less diluent in it. Does it sound like the industry is moving in that direction in a significant way, or is this going to be a marginal kind of option for them?
Well, it takes any type of these technologies and capital projects take time to develop, right? So it's how long does it take? And like most of the oil sands and most of the upstream sector, it's in recovery from the impacts of COVID. And certainly the prices means they're going to recover through that faster. And all these technologies would be impacted through that as well. When you look at partial upgrading, the advantage is it has a diluent reduction capability from it, because they're partially processing that crude oil. And so you don't need to buy and market and move as much diluent then as a result. But it also, in doing so, changes a little bit of the composition of the barrel itself. And so you can potentially access different refineries or meet different product needs down in the refineries as well. So it's a type of diversification. So not only does it try to change some of your logistical complexity of moving that barrel, but it also slightly changes the product, and it diversifies the product maybe to reach different types of configurations of refineries as well.
So it sounds like, well, my takeaway from our conversation, Kevin, is that with the new shipping capacity coming online, that there probably is no need in the 2020s for any new pipelines. And given peak oil demand appears to be just around the corner, I guess that raises the question of when, if any new pipeline would be needed even in the 2030s.
Outside of what if we include what we talked about, the optimizations, Line 3 and TMX, and we assume they're all complete, we do think the system could remain balanced on pipe. We do, however, see in the late 2020s, based on the production curves that we have in our outlook, the system could become quite tight. What I mean by that, pipelines aren't meant to run at 100%. It's good to have a little bit of flexibility to move crude oil and product around upsets. Again, some of these pipelines go to very specific destinations. Refineries take turnarounds. If you can't, if the demand goes away temporarily, you want the flexibility to move around that so you can still get your product and sell it to someone else. So when the system gets very full, it becomes very possible you could see upsets that could cause price volatility in Western Canada. We talked about earlier how you said, you made the point that the pipeline systems have done a good job in optimizing and creeping that capacity over the last half decade. But from time to time, system outages downstream and stuff, and on the logistics system had caused volatility in the system. So the differential in Western Canada moved around a lot more, making the price a little bit less predictable than if it had adequate capacity plus a little bit of extra to make sure that price stays connected to global markets.
Well, Kevin, always appreciate your insights. Thank you very much for this.
It was a pleasure. It's good seeing you.